Isn't it interesting that, police officers and nurses, firefighters in Toronto can't live in Toronto?
No, I mean, there's a huge problem.
And I think we want them to be able to live in Toronto.
Hello, I'm Giles Gherson, and this is Toronto Talks, the voice of Toronto's business community. What are we talking about? Each episode is a conversation with top business leaders about how they're shaping growth, driving competitiveness, and building up our economy. It's about what they believe it will take to make sure the Toronto region remains one of the world's great global cities. Here's today's conversation. Tony, great to have you here for our Toronto Talks episode. Really excited to have a conversation about rental housing, because that's something that, it's kind of interesting. We've gone through this condo boom in Toronto over the last 20 years, and all anybody talked about were condos.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we're at a bit of I don't know, it's too strong a word to say, collapse of the condo market, at least temporarily.
Yeah.
And everyone's talking rental. Maybe just talk for our audience a bit about the organization.
Sure.
The Federation of Rental Housing Providers of Ontario.
Yep.
Been around a long time.
Yep.
But maybe hum a few bars about that.
Great. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here with you today. Great conversation I know we'll have. So FRPO, Federation of Rental Housing Providers of Ontario, that's the word salad for sure. 1985 it is. I'd like to shorten it, but that's not a conversation for another day. 40 years old, 2,200 members. That's owners, builders, managers, suppliers to the industry, sort of the whole gambit. And so we are the largest association that advocates for strong and stable purpose-built rental housing in Ontario. I think we have a long and positive track record of collaborating with governments of various stripes, really to ensure that our members have a seat at the table. The association was created sort of coming out of rent control in the 1970s. I think at that time owners felt there was a need to come together with other like-minded individuals and organizations to have a voice. So that's where it all started. And since then, it's our mission really hasn't changed much over the 40 years, I would say, in that it remains to be one of a trusted voice to government, who government will reach out to, talk to, hear the issues, but also hear the solutions. And I think you've heard me talk about that, and I think it's vitally important. Everyone likes to criticize, but you need to come to the table with ideas that can make things better, and that's what we always try to do.
That's great. And just personally, you came to this sector, but a bit about your background.
Sure. So, government and politics is really all I've done and know how to do. And so, my first job, I won't do the whole resume because we don't have time for that, but started working in the first Mike Harris term. I came back to work for Ernie Eves, so I worked for about 8 years as Premier, as Leader of the Opposition, and outside at the Just Needs Foundation after government was done. Moved from that. I think started to feel like the pull towards public policy was there, and I was sort of at a crossroads of thinking, where do I go from here in terms of a career? Got into the world of government relations and advocacy. So whether it's been working in the property casualty insurance, auto insurance industry, high cost credit, and now rental housing. So people say, you really know how to pick the good ones. But as you know, it's
important to consumers.
Well, and as you know, industries, it's not Tide soap I'm working for. It's industries that are heavily regulated, that perhaps have some issues in terms of public perception and need to have a strong voice. And I believe that that's important to all these sectors that I've worked in, including rental housing.
Now, it's interesting. I didn't really know the statistic until fairly recently, but as much as 48% of Toronto's population lives in rental housing, which seems to be a fairly high number.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't really surprise me, perhaps given the influx of people here over the last 2 decades. Massive growth, the fastest growing municipality in North America. So it wouldn't be surprising that as people come in,
mm-hmm.
they would rent, at least to start with.
Absolutely.
That would make some sense. But how does rental affordability influence our ability to attract talent, to attract people and retain them in this region?
It is critical, right? I think for Toronto to, sort of thrive and to grow and to be everything that I think we want it to be now and into the future, we know that housing is such a critical component, right? It's so important that we have housing that is, accessible and affordable to people with different incomes, with different needs. And we know that that's something that is definitely a challenge, right? We're not saying anything that isn't known by everyone. So But I think in order to attract talent, to retain talent, you talked about, for a lot of newcomers and young people, renting is where they start out. We're seeing through our own sort of data and speaking to members, and I think just anecdotally, renting has become something, a housing option that is now, it's not necessarily something people do just for a few years. They may stay in renting longer. That's, of course, a complicated issue, or there's a number of moving parts to that. But I think regardless of what people do, where they live, we need rental housing to exist and to be affordable. And so I think for companies in Toronto, they want to be able to attract the best talent. They need to be able to say to potential recruits, we have housing available here, and you can afford it on what you're going to be earning when you start out, and you're going to be able to continue to carry through. I hear people say things to me like, isn't it interesting, you may have said this, isn't it interesting that, police officers and nurses, firefighters in Toronto can't live in Toronto?
No, I mean, there's a huge problem.
And I think we want them to be able to live in Toronto.
And teachers to be as well. Right?
Absolutely.
You've got a lot of people who we really value in our society. We need them, and they can't live anywhere near where they work.
So how do we improve that situation? Because I think it's critically important that we do for the benefit of the city and all of its citizens.
So when you think about, we talked at the beginning about, the massive condo boom that took place here over 20 or 30 years. Mm-hmm. Now it's in a state of abeyance, let's put it that way. We're sitting here looking at an empty plot of land that will be two condo towers, I think, at some point. We'll see. But a lot of these projects are on hold. I say now everyone's talking about purpose-built rental. Mm-hmm. When you think about where we need to be from your perspective in the market, in the region, in the next, say, 10 years, what would you say? Are we halfway where we need to be? Are we where? If you had the kind of the right, from your perspective, the right amount of capacity in purpose-built rental, where are we? Like we're on a journey, but where
we are, and I don't know if I can quantify it in percentage terms, but what I would say is, as you've pointed out, I mean, when I started in this industry 8 years ago, I asked a lot of questions like, so what kind of rental apartments have been getting built in Toronto over the last few decades? It was like very few, and the ones that were built were high end, and that's because those are the only buildings that could work economically. And then I started asking more questions. Why is that? So things like ending of the MERB program, the first MERB program, introduction of capital gains taxes, other tax measures that made building purposeful rental housing economically very challenging.
Right.
And so that then created this condo boom. Right, and so we know that became the de facto rental market. And in my position, I firmly believe that housing of all types is really important. So it's not about picking
exclusives.
We need it all, and we need missing middle, and we need single family, we need condominium, we need purposeful rental, we need all of it. So how much more of it do we need? I mean, there's people you can have in here, Mike Moffitt's and others who are probably better equipped to answer that. What I do know is that I think. And now we're at an interesting point, as I think you know and have pointed out, in terms of the fundamentals right now in the market. Vacancy rates are up, rents are coming down. People say to me, "Problem solved. We're good."
And there's a gap in supply, was there not?
Well, but so right now all those stats are true, and I would say, and that's I acknowledge that. That doesn't mean that our job is done.
No,
because I firmly believe that immigration is critical to the success of our country. We know that we had some challenges on the immigration file. I think some changes were made to address that. We've gone from one potential, extreme to another. There's going to have to be some meeting in the middle there. Some of these things are going to have to change in time, and when they do, we need the housing to be able, and for people that are going to come to Toronto, which we need to continue to attract to work in high tech and other sectors that are critically important. We need to be able to house them, and so I think. A lot of times it seems to me the housing file, the focus is on the here and now, the today. And I think we both know, have worked in government, that we need to be looking, longer term. And it doesn't matter what the fundamentals are saying today. I mean, they're important, but it doesn't matter relative to what the job we need to continue to do, which is to support the building of more housing and more rental housing. If we stop now and think we don't need to do anything, we're going to find ourselves in a very bad situation in 5-6 years when we haven't built anything, and all of a sudden we're saying, wait a minute, what happened? How come we're back to where we were, 6 years ago or 7 years ago, when we realized that we had a massive problem in terms of supply of housing?
But Tony, when we talk about the chatter around purpose-built rental, are we getting the action? Could we point to a lot of projects. As you said, you took this job on, you asked about rental, and you heard that there was very little built in the previous couple of decades.
Correct.
Are we seeing a huge boom in this, or is it more talk than action? What are we seeing?
So the last couple of years, and there are lots of stats out there that say that the number, now a lot of this were condos admittedly that were delivered that were now need to be absorbed, and of course are not being absorbed in the ways that people who built them thought they would be. But there were, we did see, and certainly we can also go back to the earlier years of the first Ford term. We were starting to see numbers go up. We were starting to see more starts, more completions, and I think that was due to some actions taken by the Ontario government back then. And then in the last couple of years, the stats all show that we've had sort of a record number of deliveries of apartments, whether they be condo or a purposeful rental. So I think that's all true. What are we seeing right now, though? Because as you know, the projects that were delivered last year were all many years in the making to get there. So what's coming in the pipeline after them? Not much.
Oh, really? Okay.
Not much, because again, think about the fundamentals that existed with interest rates and other factors 5 years ago or 4 years ago when some of these projects were started. We're going through the entitlement process, getting shovels in the ground. While interest rates have come down a bit, we know that that's still a pressure.
But they're more, but on interest rates, my sense is, that we're kind of at historic levels in the sense of historic average levels. In other words, if you look at where we were in interest rates, at least until 2010, the Great Recession. After the Great Recession, we had a massive drop down in interest rate levels, right? So we almost had free capital for maybe almost a decade, close to it. Then you had COVID. And then you had this spiraling up of inflation, high interest rates, and they've come down. But as I say, to me, they've kind of come down to at where we might have been in the 90s, the 80s. Like we're not at a really high level.
Agreed. Agreed.
That shouldn't be a factor, should it?
I don't think it's certainly not a primary factor. The bigger factors, as you know, are development charges.
They've come off for purpose-built rentals, haven't they? Haven't they come off for purpose-built rentals?
So they're deferred. There's
okay. Oh, until the actual until occupancy.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that certainly is the case, and that does help. But and yes, there's been some relief in terms of GST on rental. So some of those things definitely do help. But when I talk to my members, they tell me that the economic climate, and perhaps this is also just general economic confidence. Investors willing to take risks. CMHC, although that's all the different pieces are not necessarily lining up in a way that is, and still the length of time it takes to see a project's approved, while better, is still not where it ought to be. So I think all those.
What would it just give me a sense of? I mean, if you were building I don't know. There's probably no stereotype building, but say there were, 20 stories, 30 stories. I don't know what it would be. Purpose-built rental in Toronto. What would the permitting time be compared to what it should be? Like in your view?
Well, I mean, I think realistically, I think we'd love to see a scenario where we could get through permitting in a year. That's not certainly the case now, right? So it's still taking longer than that.
Now, my understanding is that permitting is sped up in Toronto in the last year, in part because of the decline in the condo market, so that whereas City Hall was sort of deluged with applications for the last many, many years, that's kind of fallen off. And so they're actually, in a sense, in better position to deal with the applications that they're getting. Are you seeing that?
Yeah, I certainly am seeing, like in Toronto, I hear people say that the zoning process has gotten better. Certainly that's improved. So I do hear that. So I do hear some improvements. Ultimately, I guess as you would know, I mean, I hear a lot of information from a lot of different people, and you try to distill it, sort of understand what it means. And we are provincial, so there's a lot of different markets, and I know we're really focused on sort of Toronto and GTA here. There are improvements happening, but the message that I get from and it's not to say that projects aren't moving forward. I have members who absolutely are putting shovels in the ground this year, moving forward on rental projects. So there is still building happening. The question is, is it how much, and is it enough? Is it what we need? And I'm not talking about the 1.5 million that was part of the I'm not really I know what that number, what you would need over a decade to meet that. I know that we're
far short of
those numbers.
Far short of that.
We're far short of that. So I'm not talking about that, but the question is, are we building enough to meet the demand? And this is where we need, whether it's data from StatsCan or from different agencies that project the finance, the population projections going forward. What are we going to need to fit to ensure that the population will be adequately housed? I don't know that we're there. I don't think we're there. It doesn't. I didn't seem.
What you're saying, Tony, it doesn't sound like despite all the talk, that there's really a purpose-built rental boom going on.
Well, I mean,
or is that wrong?
I don't know that I'm not hearing that there's a boom. I'm hearing there's a boom in certain areas, like Halifax. There's definitely a boom happening there.
Yeah.
There are certain cities where we are seeing quite a bit of construction. Saskatoon, I was there in the summer, and there's absolutely a boom happening there. So there are some places where
not here.
But I wouldn't say there's a boom in Toronto. When I talk to my members, I hear a lot of angst. I hear a lot of uncertainty. I think there are people that are, the uncertainty around government regulation is there. Are we going to see different things happening that might impact pro forma? So some people are kind of waiting to see what government's further actions might get taken. All that to say, there's a lot of pent up kind of, I think, anxiety on the sidelines, and people who, want to move forward, but just aren't doing it.
And are there tools? Is the government tool? We've talked a bit about some of the tools that governments have been using to try to stimulate development, and some of that's regulatory streamlining. Some of that's, as we've said, faster permitting. Some of it's financial incentives, the deferral of the DCs, of the development charges, the removal of GST or HST from rental buildings. I'm not sure that's what you're suggesting. It may not be enough. So the question is, I mean, what do you think is needed? And let me ask you about one thing, which is the Ontario government, for example, has the Building Ontario Fund, right? It's quite a substantial fund. Mm-hmm. And it really is for infrastructure. And I see what they've done is a fair bit on student housing. They've done things on long-term care homes. So where they're kind of pulling capital together, sort of really bringing private capital in, backstopped by the Building Ontario Fund.
Yeah.
Is there an opportunity in purpose-built rental for that?
Great question. I don't know. I've not. That's something that come across my radar that could be through that. But that's a good point, maybe for us to follow up on.
Yeah.
I just want to say quickly on DCs, because people say to me, "Come on, you got the deferral, isn't that good?" But again, recognizing the economics of for rent product versus for sale. So deferral, because there's been a lot of talk about that at our government level.
Yeah, it sounds like a big advantage.
So for us, it doesn't mean anything, because in the when you're looking at the pro forma, you're going to the lender. They don't recognize that. It still has to get paid.
Yeah, at some point. It's just not being paid up front.
But it's being paid at occupancy.
Yeah.
And you're not, it's not like you're selling units out to be able to collect money to pay them.
It's month rent.
Right. So it is, you're putting it off, but it's not, in terms of getting the loan, it doesn't.
So it doesn't change the economics fundamentally.
No, it doesn't change the economics fundamentally. That's still included. Those DCs are still included in the pro forma, which is, of course, taking into account.
And that's a big amount. I mean, we, at our housing conference recently that you spoke at, I mean, I think we said that the DCs, at least for homes now, is about $100,000 a home.
Yes, I was reading some of your data just before in preparing for this. So to me, development charges, I think are a significant issue. We know that it's getting a lot more attention over the last couple of years. We worked with Mayor Brown on a bylaw, DC relief bylaw in Brampton. We know what's happened in Vaughan and other places. I know that a couple of years ago, if I'd had those conversations, I might have been thrown out of rooms. So clearly, there are more elected officials who recognize the issue around development.
Charges. And in fact, we had Minister Rob Flack, the Ontario Municipal Affairs and Housing Minister, speak to us at the conference, and he hinted pretty strongly that he's looking for an alternative to development charges, and recognizing that development charges are in some ways grossly unfair, because they're taking a new home, whether it's for rental or for sale, and saying the first person that buys that home or rents that home is in a sense paying for infrastructure, whether it's roads, whether it's transit, whether it's community centers in this area that are going to be used for many, many, many years,
decades.
And so instead of amortizing that cost over many, many, many generations of homeowners or renters, it's coming on the shoulders of the first time, and which doesn't make any sense at all.
It doesn't.
He recognizes that. So I think he's looking for one of the different mechanisms that might be out there, that would allow the amortization of cost over the 50 years or so that those services are being used.
So as you'd imagine, we speak to the MMH minister regularly, and so whether it be the Municipal Service Corporation idea, which is now will be piloted as a result of Bill 60. And Peel, so we'll see how that goes. Is it municipal bonds?
Well,
the way to do that.
Look at the U.S. I mean, if I have a pension plan in the U.S., I would be a lot of chunk of it would be tax-free municipal bonds.
Right. So I think those are both good ideas, and I think I think we need to all acknowledge that the development charge model is broken. It no longer meets.
It's overused, I think.
Yes, and just no longer. Well, when it was created, everything was different.
Yeah,
and some things have a lifespan, just like apartments do. I think so does this, and so I think we all need to sort of acknowledge, and certainly I do, that we need a new model. We need a new system to pay for this development-related infrastructure. It's got to get paid for. No one would deny that, but the way it's paid for must change.
Must change. And I think we would completely agree with that as the board.
Yeah.
Anything else as you think about, we only got a couple of minutes left, that you would advise governments to do to open up the purpose-built rental market further?
Yeah, so you mentioned earlier, we know that there are some condo developers looking to pivot, so we will see how all that goes. We know we're seeing applications turn from condo to personal rental. I think, from my perspective, I mean, I've said this before, but I think a couple things. One, there still is a stigma about rental housing. There is. And so I think as a society, people who have a platform, who have an ability to, to speak and be heard on this issue should be trying to do everything they can to disavow that, right? We need, you travel all over the world, in a lot of parts of the world, renting is absolutely accepted.
And very common.
It's very common. And so I think we need to continue to work on that, because I still hear lots of stories, read media reports of examples where community groups fight tooth and nail against any kind of rental development, and the idea that it brings, property values down, brings in unwelcome people to neighborhoods. All of that is nonsense. So I think we need to continue to recognize that is a thought that many people still hold, and we're not going to be able to move forward in the way we need to unless we can somehow continue to work on trying to dispel some of that. So I would say that's one thing I would say for sure. And then I think in terms of the regulatory point of view, I mean, I don't want to talk out of both sides of my mouth, but I think in a lot of times government needs to get out of the way. I do think that's when you look at all the studies, all the different ministries who are involved in applications, conservation, environment, hydro. We need to figure out how to continue to streamline the process so that it can be done more quickly. But at the end of the day, Giles, I mean, if the only way that will happen is if people actually want it to happen. If the political will is there, if people say, you know what, this is important, we need for the city to thrive and to be able to attract the best talent to Toronto, we need to have more housing. That's not a bad word. It's not a bad word to have rental housing. So we need people to get on board and to recognize that doing it faster is not cutting corners. Doesn't mean it's not gonna be done properly, but it's become too embedded, too layered on with process and
so a bit of a reset is what you're saying.
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so.
Last question, because
Sure.
One of the knocks against the condo boom was that as part of the financing structure of condos, was that over time these condo units became smaller and smaller and smaller, and you ended up with these sort of 500 square feet, 600 square feet units, which of course are not fit for really more than a single individual, maybe a couple, but certainly not a family. And in fact, we've seen 80,000 people a year leaving Toronto now, mostly couples with small kids, with small families, so young families, because they couldn't find a place to live.
Yeah.
In the rental, as we look towards rental, and as your sense and your point about making it more common, making the whole idea of rental, completely commonplace, no stigma attached to it, and so on, and there shouldn't be. But for that to happen, it seems to me that the rental units are going to have to solve the problem that condos didn't, which is to have larger units. Is that possible?
I think it is possible. We have members who do build larger units as their business model, but guess where they don't build them? In Toronto.
Yeah.
So we need to, it can happen, but the places where it does happen now, development charges aren't the same kind of problem. It's time can still be an issue, but there are other factors. Land's not as expensive, and I realize that's another
important issues. Yeah.
But we do have members in the city. I can think of one who everything they've built over the last few years has been all on existing sites, and unicorn sites I call them. I've talked about it at the board before, where they already have a building and these garden style kind of garden in a park sort of apartments that were built in the 60s and 70s. Lots of land. They can build another tower or two. we should be expediting those. They should be approved very quickly.
And are those family-sized units in general, or are they building small units around family units?
No, well, I mean, I think it's a combination of both.
Yeah.
But my point just is it can happen, but I think we need to, again, get out of the way in terms of some of the red tape and regulation and allow people to do what they do best, which is build. And if the need is there, we will meet the need. That's what we do, and we'll meet that need. If we know that more family units are what's required, we'll deliver that. But we need the government to work with us.
We need the signals.
To make this happen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Tony, thank you very much. Great conversation. It could have gone on for another hour probably, but thank you for your time.
Thank you.
For the rich conversation.
It was great being with you. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to Toronto Talks, conversations with the leaders shaping the region's economy. Follow us wherever you get your podcasts.